Thanks for downloading Tech Tent from the BBC World Service. Find out more about us at bbcworldservice.com/techtent. Hello and welcome to Tech Tent, your weekly essential guide to all the hottest news and trends from the technology world. I'm Rory Catalan-Jones, and this week our stories have a common theme: the power of the tech giants over the world of work, and more broadly over how the internet works. Amazon posted and then withdrew adverts for two security analysts to monitor threats, including union activity. But it's also creating tens of thousands of jobs. So should there be concern for workers' rights? The gig economy has also created thousands of jobs, albeit insecure ones. An expert tells us why it might grow to encompass white-collar workers after the pandemic. And the internet was supposed to be for everybody, but the author of a provocative new book tells us it's been conquered by just a few giant companies. Joining me this week is BBC technology reporter Jane Wakefield. Hi Jane, what have you been working on lately?
Well, actually, I've been looking at job adverts, but perhaps not for the reason you might think. Don't worry, Rory, I'm not leaving you just yet.
We'll get more of that in a moment. Here's a taste of what's coming up.
The shock to me was speaking to all of these people deeply involved in the internet, sort of how none of them really felt like they had ownership of it. It's almost like the sort of monster that escaped the lab.
If you don't need people physically in the office, maybe you don't need them physically in the country. You know, maybe you can start to think of the whole world as your potential workforce and recruit from anywhere.
All of that soon. Now, the economic downturn that has accompanied the pandemic is seeing millions of jobs lost around the world. But the online retailer and cloud computing giant Amazon is creating jobs at an incredible rate. 7,000 announced just in the UK this week. But two posts advertised in the United States have caused controversy. The company wanted to hire intelligence analysts for a number of tasks, including monitoring the activities of labour unions. Jane Wakefield, you've been following this story. Tell us more.
Yeah, so these two posts went up, and the line that particularly captured people's imagination on this was this, as you sort of hinted at, this suggestion that the two people, these intelligence analysts that Amazon wanted to employ, must be capable of engaging and informing stakeholders on sensitive topics that are highly confidential, including labour organising threats. Now, obviously, unions have been a very touchy subject for Amazon in terms of they've made it very clear that they do not want their warehouse workers to join unions. They'd rather talk to them directly about issues. But increasingly, especially during the COVID pandemic, we've seen workers really want to start understanding what their rights are and feeling that some of the practices that Amazon employs don't sit well with how they want to keep themselves safe. Anyway, when I spoke to Amazon about this initially, they said it was a fairly standard thing for companies to do this. So as part of my investigation, I asked Marianne Rawlins, who's principal at Bradley Risk Management, whether it was indeed common for big corporations to employ intelligence analysts.
I think it is, actually. I think that large corporations do employ intelligence analysts for a variety of reasons. Most of the role, I guess, would be very necessary in a corporation that large. It's effectively an aircraft carrier of a company that they're trying to run, and they need to make sure that they have all their ducks in a row. I don't think it's legal to spy on unions per se, because there was a law passed in 1935 that prohibits that activity. So I don't know whether the language they used intended to suggest that that was what they wanted this employee to do if the role was filled, but there was an implication there, and I think that's what you're seeing Twitter and all of social media responding to.
That's Marianne Rawlins. Although they said to you, Jane, it was fairly standard, Amazon then withdrew the adverts, didn't they?
Well, that was the thing, yes. They said that the wording was incorrect and the adverts were being corrected, although I have to say I haven't found any version of this new advert that they said they've put up. So obviously it's proved a sticky issue for it, and one that it feels that it would probably rather not have written the advert in the first place, I should imagine now.
Okay, more on this. When a company is creating as many much needed jobs as Amazon, does it really deserve criticism. I've been talking to Willie Solis from the Gig Workers Collective, which lobbies for workers' rights at businesses like Amazon. I asked what he thought when he saw those controversial job adverts.
It's frightening. That's the immediate impact that I felt. And as a labor organizer, I can tell you that it is extremely frightening and scary to us that a company like Amazon is going to so openly and boldly pronounce that they're going to take these tactics. You know, it's kind of brazen, and they're not afraid of showing their hand on that. So it is definitely draws fear from people like myself, labor organizers that are taking on these companies and calling out the situation and the issues that we face as workers. To be surveilled by a company that large, it's pretty scary.
It is an extraordinarily powerful company, and it doesn't like labor unions. Is that right?
From all indications that we have, that's definitely the case. They don't want to work with workers on an individual basis when we come to them. When you take a collective action, it's clear that they balk at such a thing.
What have your interactions with them been like? Has it been hostile? Has there been any attempt to sort of reach out to try and talk?
Well, us individually as a Gig Workers Collective, we work more with gig workers than Amazon directly, but we have joined forces with the likes of Chris Smalls, which is a warehouse worker that was fired during the coronavirus pandemic for calling out Amazon on lack of PPE and safety concerns that they had. In supporting their the actions that were being taken at the time, Amazon was very, very bold in the way that they tried to stop us from being able to organize or to work with employees from that are currently employed by Amazon. We actually tried to go out to their properties as part of the staging of these protests back in May, and we were met with obvious security concerns by Amazon directly, basically barring us from the property. So it was definitely a concerning time for us as organizers. We had to basically walk on eggshells to make sure that we were 100% on the right side of the law. And in hearing that they're going down this path of targeting not only internal but external people that they see as a threat is a real concern.
I suppose Amazon might say during this difficult period of the pandemic, where lots of organizations are getting rid of workers, they are actually hiring a lot more people. They are the sort of great hope for job creation. What would you say to that?
I would say it's a circle that people go in and people go out. I actually used to work at Amazon several years ago, and I can tell you that speaking from experience, that the engine of that is Amazon is basically one that puts in workers and spits them out. That's the only way that I can explain it. So as far as job creation is concerned, I'm sure that there is some aspect of that. I'm not going to sit here and say that there isn't. But the reality on the ground is that it's a revolving door. People come in and people come out.
Willie Solis from the Gig Workers Collective. And we're going to come back to some of those issues later in the programme. Now, let's have a look at some of the week's other big tech stories with Jane Wakefield. Jane, all eyes on Facebook's role in the upcoming US elections. What's Mark Zuckerberg announced?
So it's been under pressure to crack down on political ads over fears that the platform could be used to manipulate the upcoming US election. And it has now said that it will ban new political ads for the week leading up to the election day, which is the 3rd of November. And it will also remove posts that try to suppress or discourage voting. But of course, a lot of people will say this is a bit late and a bit too little, especially when you contrast it with Twitter's blanket ban on political ads.
Yeah, and it has to be stressed, they're not banning ads completely. The existing ads that are already running will continue to run. Facebook says that's because they will have been approved and checked already. It's just they're worried about sudden new ads popping up, which could, for instance, have an impact on people knowing where to vote and stuff. Now, India has stepped up its battle with China. More than 100 mobile apps banned. What's that about?
Yeah, so you may remember that back in June, the Indian government banned 59 of the most popular Chinese apps. That included TikTok, TikTok. Well, now it's added 118 more, including several from the company Tencent, the hit video game PUBG Mobile, and WeChat Work. And according to India's IT ministry, they had credible information that the apps were transmitting data to servers located outside of India, and that the compilation of this data and the profiling by elements hostile to national security of India meant that they had to take immediate measures to stop them. But of course, the geopolitical background to this is that there have been tensions between India and China along a disputed Himalayan border.
Yeah, it seems only a few months ago that they were very closely tied up. Certainly their technology sector's now really splitting apart. And finally, one more. The Girl Guides organisation in the UK wants action on unrealistic photos on social media. What are they concerned about?
So they have backed a proposed law by a member of parliament in the UK that influencers and advertisers should be forced to declare digitally altered photos. And the point that they're making is that there are a raft of young girls who are seeing these perfect images on a daily basis, and that's having a devastating impact on their self-esteem. So it's a really kind of important issue, and one again that I think is something that we're just going to have to really get to grips with. Some questions though about whether such a law would work. We'll keep an eye on that. You're listening to Tech Tent from the BBC World Service with Rory Cellan-Jones. In a moment, who really is in charge of how the internet works? Now, we were talking earlier about Amazon's role in the world of work. It's just one company where the borders between employees and freelance operators have been blurred in what has come to be called the gig economy. So will the economic earthquake caused by the coronavirus accelerate the move to this different way of working or bring it to a halt? The Financial Times journalist Sarah O'Connor has been a dedicated chronicler of the gig economy, even going so far as to sign up as a food delivery courier for one story. I asked her what the positive and negative aspects of this phenomenon had been for both workers and companies.
Well, the main positive, I suppose, would be flexibility. I mean, that word flexibility carries a multitude of meanings. Certainly for the employer, the flexibility was fantastic. One kind of core feature of the gig economy is that these people are not actually classed as employees, they're classed as self-employed. So they're fantastically cheap. You're only paying them for the minutes that they're actually performing a task. You don't have to pay national insurance, you don't have to pay pensions, you don't have to take any responsibility for them. You just kind of hire them per minute. In terms of the people working in it, again, there was flexibility. I mean, it depends a bit on what you're doing, but if you're an Uber driver, you genuinely only have to log on to work when you want to. Lots of Uber drivers really appreciate that. Same with things like Deliveroo and some of these white collar platforms. That said, I mean, some of that flexibility, I think, is slightly illusory. It's very appealing to people when they first kind of sign up to do these jobs. But you soon find, for example, if you're an Uber driver, yes, you could decide to only drive at 2:00 in the afternoon in the suburbs. But if you want to make any money and cover your costs, you really have to work when customer demand is high. And so, you know, you actually have to work Friday, Saturday nights. You have to go to and from the airport. And so, yes, you technically have flexibility, but often in practice, you end up sort of singing to the employer's tune anyway.
Now that we are months into this extraordinary pandemic, what impact do you see that having on this pattern of work? Is it going to stay the same? Is it going to radically change?
Well, I mean, one of the things that the lockdown sort of forced employers to do, which they never otherwise would have tried probably, was to embrace kind of widespread remote working on a huge scale. You know, there would have been no reason for them to have tried this before. And lots of employers discovered that actually it's perfectly possible to have people working from home. And that they are productive and you can trust them to get on and do things. So I think in many ways that's really positive for employees who would actually rather work from home than commute for hours into cities every day. In terms of the gig economy, I suppose it might prove to employers that if you don't need people physically in the office, maybe you don't need them physically in the country. You know, maybe you can start to think of the whole world as your potential workforce and recruit from anywhere. And so you could see a sort of globalization in the way that it hit blue collar workers 20, 30 years ago. You could see that start to hit people like you and me, people who until now have been relatively insulated from it.
And what we have seen, I suppose, is a redistribution over the last 30 years of the balance of power between workers, particularly unionized workers, and employers. Is this going to accelerate that? Is this going to put more power in the hands of the employers, and in particularly those tech giants?
That's a really good question. I think it's quite possible. I mean, one of the things that tends to put more power into the hands of employees is just the macroeconomic environment. And obviously right now we're going into an era, who knows how long it will last, where unemployment is going to be really high. So actually the power that you have as a worker to demand better conditions is going to be weakened by the fact there are so many other people lining up desperate for any work. In the longer run, I mean, unions, the smarter unions, the more forward-looking unions are really starting to get to grips with the gig economy. And if you look at places like Sweden, they have started to actually unionize gig workers, to form some kind of collective bargaining with gig employers. I mean, this is all really weird and interesting and unusual because by definition, gig workers aren't employees at all. But I think you will see that unions increasingly are going to try and do more in this space because they realise that it's growing, and that if they don't, it will basically just continue to be a Wild West, which doesn't work very well for workers, particularly the lower skilled ones.
Sarah O'Connor of the Financial Times. Now, who built the internet and who has ended up running it? That's the subject of a book called The System. The author, James Ball, documents the strangely haphazard way the internet came about as a US defence and academic project, and then how its direction came to be controlled by just a handful of giant companies. I asked him what had surprised him most in his research for his book.
I think sort of the shock to me was speaking to all of these people deeply involved in the internet, sort of how none of them really felt like they had ownership of it. It's almost like the sort of monster that escaped the lab. You'd sort of talk to someone like Steve Crocker, who was there right at the very beginning in 1969. And I don't think it felt to him like the same thing he helped build somehow. It must be very odd to do a sort of project as a student and then sort of in your 70s suddenly find that it's global infrastructure.
I mean, what's interesting, isn't it, is both in the early stages of the internet and then when the World Wide Web came along, there was both a sort of libertarian feel about it. I feel that this was a different kind of territory, and also that there was a sort of egalitarian creative feel to it where this was everybody's and wouldn't be captured by the big beasts. But that happened.
Yeah, and I think the utopianism was genuine. I mean, there's always been contradictions built into the internet. It was funded right at the get-go from DARPA, which is part of the US Defense Department. But they were trying to do something revolutionary, right down to the way it handles data. On phone networks, you would be charged differently if you had an answering machine back then. The internet, data was data. That seemed really revolutionary and egalitarian. And then actually, what sort of happened is, even though they had these quite good intentions, I think, and these revolutionary ideas, because the internet makes networks and makes connections, network effects really do tend to mean you get a few big winners. And so I think because they didn't think in this way, they sort of didn't notice that they'd built a technology perfectly suited for doing just that.
You spend quite a time on how Silicon Valley effectively values companies very highly just on growth rather than on revenue. And you kind of link that to exactly what you're talking about here, which is this sort of concentration of power. How does that work?
In the offline world, let's say that you decide you've had enough of journalism and you want to start a restaurant. You can start one restaurant, get a bit of money behind it. And if you're any good, and, if we're all going out again post sort of first COVID peak, you'll get customers, you can make a nice business, and you could maybe open a second one if you wanted. But no one would think it odd if you just stuck to your one nice family restaurant. Online, you can't do that. It's basically, if you want to start a business online, you have to say, I'm going to be McDonald's in 5 years, or I'm going to have nothing. And that's because of venture capital. They will make lots of bets. And in 7 years' time, they're hoping at least one of those bets has gone 10 times, 100 times, 500 times in value. Because they want that huge return from a few winners, they're just not interested in building a medium-sized business, and certainly not a small business. It's almost like the drunken night out of financing.
Have you got any answers to any of these problems? Because you seem to be not particularly impressed by the idea of just breaking these companies up.
I think breaking up big tech sort of sounds like a fix until you think, well, what would it really do? You know, if we just split up Facebook so WhatsApp was separate again and Instagram was separate again, we'd still have 3 huge social networks. I think what we need to do is start thinking about, how do we actually want to govern this so it works for all of us? Can we do things like not just have privacy rules on our data, like GDPR, but could we have some kind of ownership right? Could we sort of even mean that we have to have a revenue split? If our data is valuable, but only in aggregate, could we get a share of it? And if we start making it so that we could move from social network to social network without losing our followers or our friends or our histories, that sort of opened things up.
James Ball, author of The System. Reading his book made me think about my first experience of using the internet 25 years ago. It was then dominated by companies we never hear of these days, like AOL and CompuServe. Jane, what about you? What's your memories of what the internet was like 25 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the days of, you know, those organisations like MySpace and Friends Reunited, when we thought that, you know, the internet was all going to be about social connections. And we now look at Facebook, and I think James used the phrase a monster that has escaped the lab, and you could apply that to a variety of the companies that have succeeded so amazingly off the back of the technology that was devised all those years ago. You know, there's been plenty of benefits as well, but I really love the point he makes about data, and I really do think that we have to find a way to pay people back for the data that they have been giving for years and years and years into these companies. Nobody's really come up with a way that we can get a share of that money yet, but I really hope that becomes a problem that people start taking very seriously, because I think we're owed something back after everything that we've ploughed into the internet for these many, many years.
And there is a big backlash around the world, not just from individuals, but from governments. We're seeing a big row in Australia, which is trying to take on Facebook and Google and make them pay for news. The tech companies, though, they're fighting back, and they're looking pretty strong at the moment. Share prices at record highs. That's all for this week. Thanks to my BBC colleague Jane Wakefield. You can read her stories and mine and get all of your tech news and videos at bbc.com/technology. And don't forget to join us again in the Tech Tent at the same time next week.